Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Joe Lopez, and I have the honor of serving as acting president and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation. And I have to say, what a crowd here tonight. I was telling Michael Knowles, I think I've told him this 3 times already tonight, that tonight is the biggest crowd we've had for an event in 2025. So he has bragging rights here. But again, thank you for being here this evening. It's so great to see so many friends, but also a lot of new faces here tonight. Before we begin, I want to recognize a few special guests in the audience this evening. Michelle Bartow, council member for the city of Newport Beach. Thank you for being here. Will O'Neill, the chairman of the Republican Party of Orange County and former mayor of Newport Beach. And Fred Whitaker, the former chairman of the Orange County Republican Party, longtime friend of the Nixon Foundation. Tonight's program is the next in our series of the Sean and Leland Smith Distinguished Speaker Series, which brings leading voices right here to the Nixon Library. Thanks to the vision and generosity of Sean and Leland Smith, we're able to bring great speakers like Michael Knowles right here to Yorba Linda. So we thank them for their tremendous generosity, and we look forward to more great events in 2026. Thank you. There are few voices today reaching young Americans as effectively as Michael Knowles. He's engaging a whole new generation in having big and important conversations about freedom, faith, and what it means to be a good American. And that's at the heart of what we're doing here at the Nixon Library. As you saw in the film here, we launched the American Civics Campaign 2 years ago to do just that, to teach the next generation about their history, about government, about the Constitution, and what it means to be an informed and engaged citizen. Michael Knowles is leading that same mission in his own way and using an amazing platform with his show, The Michael Knowles Show, where he's challenging ideas, he's sparking debate, and he's inspiring young people to think for themselves. You know him as the host of The Michael Knowles Show for the Daily Wire. He's also the host of the book club at PragerU. He's a #1 national best-selling author and one of the most influential voices in America today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Knowles to the Nixon Library.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Wow. A Republican does not expect that kind of welcome in California. That's great. That's great. At the Nixon Library, you get it. Thank you so much for having me. It is a great pleasure to be here at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. Really, I should say, it is a great pleasure to be back at the Nixon Library. I visited here a little over 10 years ago. I think it was 11 years, first time I came to the Nixon Library. A friend and I were crossing the country. I was moving from New York to LA, and along the way, we decided that we were going to stop at some of the presidential libraries. So we hit the George W. Bush Library in Dallas. We briefly were at the Clinton Library in Arkansas. Didn't have to stay very long at all. And then the last stop was going to be the Reagan Library in Simi Valley. But along the way, the penultimate stop was going to be the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda. Now, for most of my life, the Republican Party and the conservative movement have sidelined Richard Nixon. They portrayed his presidency as, at best, a footnote in the great march of conservatism in America, and more often, as a regrettable source of embarrassment. The Nixon Museum, therefore, was less impressive than the magnificent and much feted Reagan Library. It was more a curiosity for young conservatives than a source of inspiration. This was almost a dozen years ago. And then something surprising happened. A couple years after I visited, the Nixon Library underwent a $15 million renovation. This was a major physical rehabilitation that, in the course of history and, dare I say, providence, coincided with a major reputational rehabilitation of President Nixon himself. The renovation was announced in mid-2015 at almost precisely the time that the Obama administration and Democrat campaign operatives cooked up their plan to undermine Donald Trump, to spy on his campaign, to fabricate evidence of supposed wrongdoing, and ultimately, if they could not stop him from being elected at all, they would try to remove him from office with the threat of impeachment. History might not repeat itself, but it rhymes. We see trends sometimes. In 2016, as museum goers began to see the Nixon Library in a new light, the American public began to see the Nixon legacy in a new light too. Perhaps we had misjudged the man who had won the largest popular vote landslide in American history. Perhaps we have been deceived by the media, by the government, by feckless conservatives. Perhaps there were lessons to learn from President Nixon, now more than ever. One of the reasons, there were many reasons why I said I had to come to this event tonight. One of them is there are not many occasions to wear my original Nixon campaign tie clip from the committee to re-elect the president, now more than ever. So, back to the story. As the Trump administration got underway, the liberal networks called in Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, veteran performers in a dying vaudeville show. They were called onto all of the news networks to utter the three words that constitute their only memorable act. You know what the words are. Lights up, cameras on, the anchor asks about the political controversy du jour, and Woodward and Bernstein dutifully proclaim that whatever it is worse than Watergate. That's it. How much do they get paid for each of those words? Unfortunately for the left, the tactic backfired because most Americans knew that the allegations against President Trump were ridiculous. The public had, at that time, known Donald Trump for some 4 decades, coincidentally going back to about the Nixon administration. No serious person believed that the host of The Apprentice was some kind of KGB spy. It didn't work. So, rather than indicting Trump, the accusations began the process of exonerating Nixon, at least in the minds of many Americans, and I would say especially in the minds of younger conservatives. President Trump never colluded with the Russians, but the intelligence community and the FISA courts did collude with the media and a Democrat presidential campaign to frame an innocent man. And all of a sudden, some strange facts about Watergate began to raise eyebrows. The fact, for instance, that, as President Nixon himself observed, 6 men were brought in to do a job that one trained professional could have done. That was a little bit weird. The fact that most of the men had worked with the CIA, and one of them was actively working with the CIA at the time, that was a little weird. The fact that the Democrat National Committee and at least one member of the media, Jack Anderson, had advanced knowledge of the break-in, that was a little bit weird. The fact that the DNC, relative to, say, a campaign committee, possessed relatively little useful information and was an unlikely target of the break-in, that was a little bit weird too. And the fact that the break-in was so preposterously, one might even say implausibly, botched. All of that was pretty weird. On top of the fact that it was all completely unnecessary because President Nixon was outpolling his opponent 2-1 and went on to win handily in a landslide. From the perspective of 2016 and 2017, Watergate no longer looked like the crime of the century. It didn't even really look like a crime that had been blown out of proportion. It began to look, as it looks even more so today, like a setup. The American public saw the lengths to which deep staters would go to undermine the will of the electorate in the case of President Trump. Was it so crazy to think that they might have done the same to the man who took out Alger Hiss? Was it so crazy that the man whom they dubbed Tricky Dick might be the target of their shenanigans? Many people, I suspect, came to the same conclusion that Bill Murray declared on Joe Rogan's show earlier this year. Did you catch the episode? Bill Murray goes on Joe Rogan's show, and he had just read Bob Woodward's book on John Belushi. And he said, quote, "I read like 5 pages of Wired by Bob Woodward, and I went, oh my God, they framed Nixon." I don't think he was joking. Murray had the experience that many of us have had when we first learned to distrust the liberal media. Do you know, some of you will know the experience. You're reading the newspaper, you're looking at articles online, and it's about some topic that's exotic, and so they say something and you don't know if it's true or false, and so you say, okay, I guess it's true. And then you read about some other foreign topic that you have no knowledge on whatsoever, and you say, oh, I don't know, I guess, sure, I'll take their word for it. And then you read about something that you know, whether it's bond markets, whether it's the New York Yankees, whatever, you read about something you know about, and then you realize that the newspaper is completely making it up and they don't have any clue. And then some people just go right back to the topics with which they're unfamiliar and they believe it anyway. But some of us say, hold on, maybe the newspapers aren't telling us the truth. That was the Bill Murray conclusion with respect to Richard Nixon. I think he was probably right. Changing political circumstances have likewise inclined the public to reevaluation of President Nixon. During the relative political calm of the 1990s, when the most pressing issues were the president's hands-on approach to the White House intern program, as well as the meaning of the word is, these were top of mind. At that time, serious lessons of statecraft that might be learned from someone like President Nixon were an afterthought. The quasi-religious zeal for spreading democracy that followed the trauma of 9/11 likewise did not conduce to much political introspection. But fast forward to the Trump era, and all of a sudden, President Nixon seems to have quite a lot to offer. A Democrat Party given over to its extreme left flank, overtly anti-American demonstrations, left-wing riots in the streets, a surge in high-profile assassinations and broader political violence, racial strife stemming from the left and prompting a potentially counterproductive reaction on the right, popular frustration with forever wars overseas, a world order in a state of generational flux, and a singular figure despised by the political class but beloved by the electorate, alternately scorned and celebrated after decades in the public eye, who accepted defeat in a contested and dubious election before mounting an historic political comeback, who seems to be the only man capable of keeping the country together. Are we talking about 2025 or 1968? If we didn't say the names, would anyone be able to tell the difference? It's very tempting to say that what vindicated Nixon is the discovery of some new information about his presidency or his resignation or his broader career, or about the media, or about the deep state, or whatever. To some degree, I guess that's true. But what has really vindicated President Nixon is the history that has unfolded ever since. The problems that we now face are the problems that he overcame. The forces that sought to destroy him are the forces that threaten us again now. After some 50 years in the political wilderness, President Nixon is once again a man for the moment. I'm reminded of a line from Cardinal Manning, which he uttered after the Battle of Mentana for Rome in 1867. He said, "There is a day to come which will reverse the confident judgments of men." For decades, the Republican Party seemed certain that Ronald Reagan, the tax cutter, the deregulator, the Cold War winner, could do no wrong. And the party was convinced that Richard Nixon, the EPA founder, the gold standard abandoner, I don't know what the noun would be for that, the Cold War diplomat, that President Nixon could do no right. Today, however, the Reagan legacy faces a bit more criticism from a right increasingly concerned with deindustrialization, class politics, and the social consequences of mass amnesty for illegal aliens. Likewise, an increased appetite for prudent regulation, economic nationalism, and triangular foreign policy has given the Nixon legacy new life. Some ossified political pundits consider this reevaluation to be nothing short of heresy. Hypocrisy, yes, but really, heresy is what they think. They consider any deviation from the Republican Party talking points of 1983 to be a betrayal of the sacred faith of Reaganism. Even the contemplation of a protective tariff merits burning at the stake to some of these people. Never mind, of course, that Reaganism, with the ism, differs considerably from the actual policies advanced by Ronald Reagan. Like most religious traditions, the latter disciples have deviated somewhat from the founder. This urge to divide into factions is a recurring theme on the right. The left has not had this problem in many years. The left unifies. While I suppose the left, the Democrats, used to include some bulldogs, today there are two factions, the progressives and the super progressives. That's it. And John Fetterman. To be fair, John Fetterman is there. That guy's great. Every day he recovers more and more. He seems to move more to the right. For those who couldn't hear, say, he'll be one of us soon. That's right, Senator Fetterman. The water's warm. No, I kind of like him I like him in the Democrats just to cause them problems. That's the Democrats. The Republicans, meanwhile, divide into every category imaginable. The libertarians, the neocons, the paleocons, the traditionalists, the religious right, the country club Republicans, the new right, the new right. I used to be on the new right. I am somewhat older now. I think I'm on the paleo new right. I don't know. If we were to list every single faction on the right, we would be here all night. Each of these factions claims the legacy of some forebear to the exclusion of the others. The neocons miss the halcyon days of George W. Bush bombing the Middle East. They do. They look fondly on it. Put their head on their pillows at night. They abhor the foreign policy restraint of President Trump or of President Nixon before him. The country club Republicans long for the days of the clubbable George Bush Sr. They likewise cannot stand our current colorful president, just as they were wary of the cowboy Ronald Reagan before him. Don't get the libertarians started on the progressive Teddy Roosevelt. You'll be there all night. For them, it's Coolidge or bust. And as a traditionalist myself, I miss Chester Alan Arthur, mostly for the mutton chops, which were very fashionable at the time. The infighting is not limited to historical legacies. Far from it. As Republicans look ahead to the end of President Trump's term, assuming that we don't repeal the 22nd before then, it's an open discussion. It's probably not going to happen, but it's an open discussion. As we look ahead, there is a veritable civil war brewing for the future of the American right. Isn't there always a civil war brewing? It seems every year you could make the same observation, but it's heated up. The free marketeers declare that Republicans have long been deregulators. The economic nationalists respond that before we were deregulators, we were regulators, that the GOP was actually founded on tariffs. The hawks argue that Republicans have long supported foreign policy intervention, particularly in the Middle East. The Doves respond that we were once the party of restraint, of America first before that, and so on and so forth. There are accusations, there are recriminations, there are all sorts of claims that the other side is not truly conservative. It seems to me, however, that these belligerent factions miss the point entirely. And the revitalization of the Nixon legacy is a good time to recognize that the history of the conservative movement is not, in fact, a tale of ping pong between the orthodox and the heretics. One need not pick, for instance, Nixon or Reagan in a choose-your-own-adventure story of conservatism. There is, mirabile dictu, continuity in the story of the American right. Reagan campaigned for Nixon, as a Democrat no less, in the 1960 presidential election. Reagan stood by Nixon during Watergate. After he was elected, Reagan took Nixon's recommendations for Secretary of State, CIA Director, and Attorney General. Those are pretty big positions. Pat Buchanan, another man who worked for both Nixon and Reagan, has observed that Nixon also gave Reagan his first national security advisor, his first domestic policy chief, his second Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, his Chief Justice nominee, and his Fed chairman. Nixon's reach extended even into the Bush administration. These continuities among supposedly contrary figures confound ideologues. Nuance and subtlety of thought confound ideologues. Therefore, Richard Nixon confounds ideologues. Of all of President Nixon's admirable qualities, it is precisely this, his nuance and his subtlety of thought, that are most needed in the Republican Party and the conservative movement today. As we come to terms with the end of the Trump era, as we jockey and scramble for the future of the American right, a few lessons from President Nixon come to mind. The first lesson, and I cannot stress this enough, stop being so whiny and emotional. I'm not talking to you in this room. You seem like very tough people. I'm speaking to the internet, to all, especially the conservatives on the internet. They whine and they whine and they divulge too much. This is the avocational hazard of the social media age. But conservatives would do well to remember that we don't need to tweet every thought and feeling, every personal antagonism that comes to our minds. In President Nixon's own words, I don't know, I haven't worked on my Nixon that well. Nixon said, even with close friends, even with close friends, I don't believe in letting your hair down, confiding this and that and the other thing, saying, gee, I couldn't sleep. I believe you should keep your troubles to yourself. That's just the way I am. Some people are different. Some people think it's good therapy to sit with a close friend and, just spill your guts and reveal their inner psyche, whether they were breastfed or bottle-fed. Not me, no way. President Nixon, please. Let all who have ears to hear, let them hear, please. Conservatives on the internet. Not only is oversharing unseemly in a conservative, it is counterproductive to coalition building. I do not need to know my politicians' superfluous, innermost thoughts. I don't need them to tell me the details of their private lives or their every affection and animosity, which politicians and pundits they love, which they hate, why I'm supposed to share all of their affections and animosities. I don't care. Keep it professional. Act like a man. Bring as many people to our side as possible, and when you've got to kick someone off the team, be it for moral or purely electoral reasons, do it fast and ideally behind the scenes. More than anything, stay focused on what really matters. Second lesson, eschew ideology. Good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. As far as I'm concerned, beyond that, everything is negotiable. I don't mean to be glib here, This first precept of the natural law takes on a more definitive shape within our constitutional order and our political tradition, of course. But conservative statesmen have a great deal of wiggle room on policy, on coalitions, on everything else, as well they should. Indeed, as they must, because in politics, we apply eternal principles to constantly changing circumstances. To just use an example that pops to my head, sometimes a gold standard benefits America's economy and position in the world. Sometimes it doesn't. Recognizing that doesn't make you a hypocrite. Recognizing that means that you have nuance and subtlety of thought, and you recognize that things change in the world, and you have a vision for the future. Sometimes domestic circumstances call for a hard line against communism in all its forms. Sometimes grand strategy calls for an alum of the House Committee on Un-American Activities to go visit China. There's no contradiction there at all. That's called maturity. That's called wisdom. That's called using the resources available to you. Contrary to the bloviation of many pundits, politics is a practical rather than a theoretical science. The paramount political virtue is not precision, but prudence. The slogans and policies through which politics is conducted are not monuments for all time. Eventually they fail, and new policies must be pursued according to the judgment of the men who we choose to lead us. Third lesson, very important. Nothing is ever finished in politics. Nothing is ever set in stone. Nothing is ever invulnerable to reversal. That lesson might serve as an inspiration, and it should serve as an inspiration. It should also serve as a warning not to get complacent. We've suffered decades of defeat, and so we like to hear that. And we see that things can change. For goodness sakes, the overruling of Roe v. Wade, something that very few people thought would happen in our lifetimes, just happened. That can happen. But also, as we get a little taste of victory, recognize none of these political victories lasts forever. President Nixon put it well. Should I try it again? I'll try it again. Okay. A man is not finished when he's defeated. He's finished when he quits. That is not some touchy-feely bromide. President Nixon was not a touchy-feely man. You can describe him in many ways. I don't think we would call him touchy-feely. He was stating a plain fact, a fact that he proved in 1952 when he almost lost the vice presidential nomination over a bunch of media cooked-up nonsense. It was a fact he proved in 1968 after everyone had counted him out. And it's a fact he proved over 2 decades of his post-presidency. And it's a fact that he proves even more clearly, ever more clearly today, as history vindicates President Nixon's legacy now more than ever. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll open it up now for Q&A. So if you have a question, raise your hand. This is your opportunity to ask your question. I see a hand over there, and I'll get to that side shortly. I saw a hand here. Perfect.
It's a lot of people. I love that. This is great.
Didn't think I'd be first. I'm a little nervous. First question, what'd you have for breakfast this morning?
Great question.
What'd you have for breakfast this morning?
That was a great question. My beloved wife, sweet little Elisa, cooks me breakfast every morning. Because Richard Nixon was a very old school man. You know, he basically went swimming in a full suit and tie and everything. And I try to model my life after that kind of standard. So I need to have eggs in the morning. I don't do cereal, my children can. For me, I need to be like a guy from the 50s, you know? I don't plug up those arteries. And so this morning I had a magnificent omelet made by my beloved long-suffering wife, a cheese and ham omelet. She also made little muffins and 2 shots of espresso. It was a simple breakfast. Very, very important question.
Fantastic. What would you say to people? My husband and I are super conservative, and our parents are basically CNN talking heads. What would you say to people that their parents just are, in a way, disappointed and go out and say, how liberal their views are and how, conservatives should all kick dirt?
A great thing about the libs is they have all these kind of crazy ideas, like children are going to teach us everything, and which is total nonsense, of course. But it doesn't mean that you can't use their ideas against them. So, you might just point out, listen, Mom and Dad, I know, listen, guys, we want you to get hip to the jive and everything, and, well, we're just out of the mouth of babes. We're telling you that you need to vote for Trump and then J.D. Vance in 2028, and it's just where the kids are at, man. Don't yuck my yum. You do you, or I don't know, whatever. But it is kind of funny that we're living in this moment where the youngest generation is considerably more conservative than the older generation. It's great. I mean, it's a great place to be. And this is really throughout all manner of public policy, and especially social policy. You find that the generation that's most open to divorce, for instance, is the boomers. And the most opposed are the Zoomers. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe there's a connection there. But it's true on all matters of family, which is this bedrock political unit, borders, national identity. So you might just gently and lovingly, while revering your parents, which you're enjoined to do by our Lord and by the Bible, you might just point out that liberalism hasn't really worked out that well. And you might recognize that some of the liberals had the best of intentions. Many of them did not, but your parents probably did, one hopes. And you can say, look, you were pursuing goals that were just kind of ill-conceived. It just didn't really work out. So, if the idea was to just maximize individual autonomy, which manifests on the left in essentially weird sex stuff, pardon the bluntness, and on the right manifested in, I guess, economic policy, you say, well, look, there's something to that. We don't want to live in the total state, but we also have to have some kind of political community. We need to have a sense of the common good. All political communities rest on certain fundamental premises. They're the axioms from which we must think. They're not just the conclusions that we arrive to asymptotically after endless debate. And so, look, we tried your way for a while, Mom and Dad, and it didn't really work out that well. I mean, you had the breakup of families, you had an influx of illegal aliens, a decline in social solidarity, 85% of Americans saying political violence is getting worse, massive problems with entitlements that could sink the entire national economy. You've had America losing her position in the world. Are we depressed enough yet? Shall I go on? So anyway, maybe Mom and Dad, maybe it's time to try a different course. I mean, I think that's the way to approach it. And just point out, just as the boomers were reacting against something, rightly or wrongly, so too the Zoomers are reacting against real social problems. And there's no great shame in that. It's a fallen world, and different problems crop up in every generation. But the age of Aquarius is over, and we want a little bit of order, and we want a normal country again.
The next question is right over here.
Mr. Knowles, I'm right here.
Hey.
So last election, President Trump did very well with younger voters, Gen Z, especially among Gen Z men. But recently, YouGov polls indicate that Gen Z, especially highly educated Gen Z youth, are trending towards people like Zoran Mamdani, and they're also trending towards things like atheism, agnostic beliefs, etc. So how can we, as young men, as young conservatives, win back this, I guess, elite human capital to America First conservatism and Christianity?
Great question. What's going on with Gen Z, I think, is a little bit more complicated. And so I suppose we'll see tomorrow night after the elections exactly how things are breaking, perhaps. But with Gen Z, they're either trans or they're like wearing black shirts marching with Mussolini. And there's not a ton of middle ground. Whereas the millennials are just kind of distressingly liberal. You know, they're just kind of liberal in this very cringy, lame Obama-era way. And Gen X doesn't care at all. Gen X is totally unplugged from anything political. And when the boomers are you know, hungover from Woodstock. But with Gen Z, they're just politically schizophrenic. So on the one hand, they're going to elect a Muslim communist in New York, and on the other hand, they view Trump as hopelessly liberal, you know, and they want someone who's more rock-ribbed, which is a fine sign. You know, things were cracking up, and they're a sign of the times. So what we need to do, I think, is encourage the young conservatives, the young right-wingers who have the right impulse, and we need to condition some of their rougher edges, as we do for all young people, you know, across all generations. And we need to encourage them in habits of virtue. I think this is ultimately what's going to work. Because, you know, ideologues on both sides want to think about politics as just a set of policy prescriptions or a handful of slogans that you can memorize and you know, perceive in your intellect, and then it's all fixed. But that's not true. We're incarnate creatures. So you actually have to just cultivate habits of virtue. And it's not enough to talk about how great family is. You have to get married. And it's not enough to talk about how we need more kids. You have to have a bunch of kids, which is very fun. The first part of it's really fun. And the latter parts are fun too, actually. It's not enough to talk about how important Christianity is to our culture. You have to go to church, and you have to get on your knees, and you have to literally avail yourself of sacraments, and you have to treat God as though he exists, which he does. You have to do all these things. I think they want to do it. I think both sides of the schizophrenic Gen Z are bereft of meaning. They realize that there is this dearth in their lives. They realize that new atheism and the glib consumerism of the Obama era is unsatisfactory. When Obama suggests that the reason we have jihadis in the Middle East is because they don't have the latest iPhone or something, it's so totally absurd and contrary to man's actual nature. We're not just blobs of meat, you know, we're not purely material. So both of them know it. And the left-wingers in Gen Z think that they're going to resolve this by finding their true self divorced from their bodies, and they indulge this Gnostic pseudo-religion of transgenderism, for instance. And the right-wingers are looking a little more traditionally for liturgy and religion and the political implications of that, because religion is a public act. That's great. They have to do it, though. They have to put it in their bodies. And I think we're mimetic creatures, and I think they'll see that the ones on the right are generally happier and better looking and more successful, and things are working out better. And I think you'll see a big shift. And I mean this quite particularly and sincerely. I've had people who come up and say, Michael, I used to have purple hair, and I was trans, or I was a they, them, or something, but luckily I didn't go all the way, and then I considered some other ideas, and now I'm so happy. You know, my problems were diagnosed, and I'm pursuing the truth, and it's a lot better. So it can happen. I think it is going to happen. You know, the left-wing idea reached such a preposterous logical conclusion in the trans ideology. You know, I don't think you can remain that divorced from reality for very long. I think that's why you saw a big pushback. I think that's why you saw the 2024 election go the way that it did. And I think we just need to capitalize on that.
All right. Our next question right over here, all the way to your left side right here.
Hi, Mike. It's great that you came here today because, and also talked about the many factions within the conservative movement, because just today, it is pretty safe to say that Ben Shapiro pretty much declared war between the neocons and the America First movement, and pretty much against anyone who would Tucker Carlson, PBD, or anyone who would platform, dare I say his name, the Voldemort, Nick Fuentes. So given that, I ask you that, do you have, it's basically forced people to take sides, and do you completely support, or do you deviate at all from Ben Shapiro in this sense?
Do I deviate from Ben Shapiro? I've been deviating from Ben Shapiro for 10 years. What are you doing? He and I have, on dailywire airwaves, been debating all manner of issues for 10 years, which is kind of the point of dailywire. I mean, that's the reason that you have a Ben there, and a me, and a Matt Walsh, and all the rest. So yes, that's not my strategy. You know, I think my strategy for all of the various factions of the right, factions that have been longstanding within the right, groups that want to enter into the right, groups that campaign for Democrat candidates and oppose Republican candidates but are still putatively on the right. All of these matters. My strategy on it, vis-a-vis Election Day, which, it's Monday before a major election day in New York, in New Jersey, in Virginia, my inclination is to remain focused on the prize. There are major contests that are going to set the stage for the midterm elections, and then we'll set the stage for the 2028 presidential election. What you mentioned is really interesting too, because notice what we weren't talking about. You mentioned Ben or Tucker or Fuentes or this person or that. Not one of those people holds public office. Not one of those people writes bills. Now, they're pundits, so they offer intellectual diagnoses. They also offer entertainment and have popular podcasts and streams and things, which is great. Some of my best friends are podcasters. I love it. Hell, it pays my mortgage. But I just think that can very often become a distraction. And it is an example of the American right sometimes getting a little too insular and playing a little inside baseball, because frankly, much of the American voting public has no idea about infighting and antagonisms and hostilities, doesn't pay attention to that, maybe has never heard of one or more of those people. And that's probably good. Those are the normal people. I think we frankly should encourage more of that, even though it might hurt our bottom lines. And so I just think when these hostilities and antagonisms, as you know, I've been friends with Ben for a decade, and I was on Tucker's show a month or two ago, had a lovely breakfast with Tucker, and saw him again a few weeks ago. They love to focus on all sort of inside baseball. When those antagonisms touch on real, concrete, practical politics, then I will concern myself. When those antagonisms lead to tens of thousands of voters switching sides in some swing state, Michigan or something, then I will concern myself with that. Then I think it will be important to really focus on that. In the meantime, it seems to me like these are personal fights that go back a long ways, and in some ways intersect with public policy, and in some ways are kind of personal. And that's fine, they can hash it out, but that's not my concern. I think it's better for the right-wing coalition to keep our eyes on the prize. As I mentioned in my speech, if we're gonna circumscribe coalitions, as all coalitions must be, we do that out of the public eye, we do that in a mature, manly, Nixonian way, and we keep on and carry on.
All right, the next question is all the way back in the nosebleeds, down the center, all the way in the other room, right over here.
All right, Mr. Knowles, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. My name is Sage. I'm a current student at Chapman University, and I had the pleasure of being on your Zoom call with Johnny Burtka in the middle of September through the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and you said something that really stood out to me about Charlie Kirk's horrible assassination. You said that we had a marketplace of ideas, and then the left shot it up. I wanted to ask you, is there still a marketplace of ideas in the right wing? And as student leaders, how can we engage in that marketplace of ideas without it falling apart? Thank you.
Wonderful question. There is obviously a robust marketplace of ideas on the right. In fact, the last question we heard about was focused very much on that. You get 100 right-wingers in the room, they will find the one issue they all disagree on and rip each other's throats out over. The left, you don't really see that as much. The problem is there's not much of a marketplace of ideas in the country as a whole, in the public square of the United States, because the left won't tolerate it. And we've seen figures of this for many years now on college campuses, at public events where the left protests or throws a smoke bomb or pulls a fire alarm. They've been doing this for years and years, or riots or assassinates a speaker. So what this means is that we need to restore order. And this is my point that I guess was somewhat controversial, but I don't think it should be. Marketplaces of ideas, like all marketplaces, require certain rules. They require common media of exchange. They require certain behaviors and limits in order to have faith in the marketplace. If bandits come in and shoot up the marketplace, You're not going to have buyers and you're not going to have sellers. You need to have integrity in the marketplace. And so I think we need to restore order. And practically speaking, what that means is we need to exclude certain suicidal ideologies and disordered behaviors. We need to get them out of the marketplace of ideas. I know this runs contrary to the idealistic libertarian musings of much of the American right in the 20-teens, which inveighed against cancel culture and promoted free speech absolutism. I'm happy to say I was not part of that. And I wrote a book actually arguing against that at the time, and I think that thesis has been vindicated now. You need to have certain limits. You need to have, in the words of G.K. Chesterton, you need to stop the thought that stops thought. If you are to permit, but think of the First Amendment, if you were to permit protections for fraud, for direct threats, for obscenity, you would not be expanding the marketplace of ideas, you would be shrinking it, because all of those speech acts actually undermine rational discourse. That's what we have to do on the left. And so, to be really blunt about it, it means we need to fire the people who celebrated Charlie's assassination. And we just have to do it. And we don't even have to do it just because it would make us feel good, though it would make me feel good. We have to do it because you can't have schools where the teachers openly want to kill half the students. You can't have hospitals where the nurses want to kill half the patients. You can't have a restaurant where the waiters want to kill half the customers. You just can't have that. That undermines all of those institutions. And to call for the murder of the most prominent promoter of civil dialogue in the country, to celebrate that murder, to justify that murder, is to undermine the whole public square. And if you can't apologize, if you can't change your mind, if you can't grow up, you need to be excluded from that public square and go somewhere else.
Next question is to your right, all the way to your right here.
Hello, Mr. Knowles. Thank you for coming. Wonderful remarks. I'm a student at Claremont McKenna College. Invitation's always open if you want to come, by the way.
Sounds
But for those of us that are students on campus and that are conservative, it seems like academia has sort of always been like this hotbed of like extreme liberalism. So I guess. How do we not even reclaim it, reclaim college campuses when I guess we never had them in the first place, but yeah, like claim them?
I guess we had them. When was the University of Bologna founded? That was like 800 years ago or more. It hasn't been great since then. Certain institutions can be defended and can be really conducive to human flourishing. I think of Ave Maria University. I think of Hillsdale. I think of Franciscan. I think there are a handful. TAC is out here, Thomas Aquinas College. There are others too. There you can send your kids. They'll get a good education. And I know for a while, conservatives said we should only send our kids to go get engineering degrees or something practical. I totally disagree with that. I think it's great to read dusty old books. I'm a big promoter of dusty old books and liberal education, for making sense of our freedom and our leisure and to be civilized people. I think it's great. I love it. It's hard to get, though. It's hard to get at most universities. It's hard to get at the brand name universities. Schools like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, which once were, incomparably prestigious, I think they've come down a peg or two. And so what do we do about those? I think Trump is doing a great job pummeling Harvard into submission. I've wanted to pummel Harvard into submission for 15 years, and he's doing it. I think it's important to make an example of a school that's really clearly lost its way. Some institutions can be preserved and defended, and your donations and sending your kids there will help. Some institutions are just beyond repair, and you can't put the new wine into old wineskins, and they need to be destroyed. Harvard delenda est, perhaps. How do we distinguish which is which? Very, very carefully. We do so with prudence and judgment. There's no one-size-fits-all policy. But they should worry. Those universities should worry. The trustees should worry. The radical professors should worry. They need to be reined in, and they need to fulfill the mission of the university. If they don't do what they're for, then they should not be receiving federal money, and they probably shouldn't be around anymore.
Question center right.
In the absence of Charlie Kirk and his passing, I know you two had your not butting heads, but Catholic, Protestant moments that happened. how do we rectify, and I'm kind of not asking this as a gotcha, but how do we rectify the Marian dogma of, immaculate, but also without sin? And then possibly more importantly, how do we get more young people into the faith that have turned so far away from it?
Sure. On your first question, you say, how do we rectify Marian dogma? Do you mean that you don't accept Marian dogmas? Okay, got it. Well, the way we're going to do it is we're just going to keep them, and we're going to convince you eventually. That's what we're going to do. You mentioned Charlie and I. We've been going back and forth on religion for 10 years almost, and I don't want to tell tales out of school. I don't. Because sometimes the conversations off camera were different in tone, say, than the conversations on camera. And sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were equally belligerent off camera. What I think I can reveal, without feeling bad about it, is Charlie was really serious about religion. And it's frankly almost the only thing we talked about off camera. Occasionally other things, but that was it. That's what he wanted to talk about. And he was very earnestly pursuing the truth, and he was willing to explore all sorts of ideas. And he was willing to punch back on all sorts of ideas. And sometimes he'd punch back really hard, and then that would be the sort of thing that he would be inclined towards. So everyone's trying to fight over, would Charlie have ended up Catholic or Eastern? I've never saw him grow a beard, so I don't know if he could be Eastern Orthodox or, would he have remained Protestant or this kind of, and it's all kind of a moot point, at this point. I think he stated his religious views publicly and privately to some of us, and so we pray for him. At least we Catholics pray for him. I know some opinions vary on, but I certainly pray for him. I think it's good to, and I think his faith in Christ was manifest, and he said it's what he most wanted to be remembered for. How do we bring people to the faith? He did a hell of a job at it, didn't he? I mean, he was really yeah. You'll be unsurprised to find out I go to a very traditional church in Tennessee, where everyone wears like three-piece suits and top hats, and it's, as we often say, dating at the traditional Latin Mass, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. People are, they're a little over the top, but because of that, you can tell when a new person just stumbles in off the street, because they're not wearing the whole wardrobe. And after Charlie was killed, I saw a lot of people in T-shirts and jeans, and I've never been happier to see people in T-shirts and jeans, because it meant people who had not been to church just wanted to go to the closest church they could find. And I think you saw that throughout the country. So how do you lead people back to the faith? It is happening. It just is happening. It was happening before Charlie was assassinated. I think it's accelerated dramatically since then. It's happening because the new atheism was always weak, and it was a cheap shot at Christianity using a Muslim terror attack as the excuse. It was more a publishing phenomenon than an intellectual trend. It's because people need meaning. It's because man is fundamentally a religious creature. It's because our longings do, in fact, have satisfaction when we talk about food, when we talk about drink, when we talk about cigars, in my case. And our deepest longing is for God, and God exists too. Fundamentally, the reason people are returning to the faith is because God exists, and Christ is who he says he is, and he founded a real church. And so that's going to happen. We can help it along. We're called to make disciples of all nations. But Rudyard Kipling was right when he said that the gods of the copybook headings return, and God is the God of the gods of the copybook headings. So he's revealed himself again as well.
Next question, center left or right over here.
Hi, Michael. My name's David. Huge fan. Thank you for coming. Very excited. So my question is, I think a lot of the division is caused, in America is caused from not having the same goals in mind, where one day both Democrats and Republicans had the same goal, but different ways to obtain it, such as wanting to protect children and babies, but there's no longer a shared goal with one party who wants to kill babies and the other to save them, amongst other divisions, obviously. Can our country once again have common goals with different ways to get there, or are there other reasons for the division in America?
Yeah, look, some of the pro-abortion crowd wants to sacrifice babies to Moloch, for sure. They do. Planned Parenthood posted yesterday this picture in this weird retro styling that said, you can have as many abortions as you want or need, which is a far cry from Hillary Clinton's nonsense about safe, legal, and rare. But it's really the logical conclusion. Safe, legal, and rare never made any sense. You know, if it's murdering babies, it shouldn't be legal. If it's not murdering babies, then there's no need for it to be rare. So that idea had momentum, and it reached its logical conclusion. And the people who would say, you can have as many abortions as you want, you know, you go get them, they're probably deeply, deeply spiritually dark. However, there are plenty of people who support abortion who do so because they're pursuing a perceived good, and the perceived good is freedom. You know, the perceived good is individual autonomy, something like that. And they just misunderstand freedom. They think freedom is neutrality in choosing rather than what it actually is, which is the right to do what one ought to do. So that we can help educate them. And they make an idol out of individual autonomy, which is fine in its proper place, but it's not the be-all and end-all. You know, that would be putting the cart before the horse. And so I think we can recognize that people are pursuing goods that are just mistaken. Now, whether they'll speak to us about it is another matter. You know, I'm more than happy to speak in that charitable and gracious way to them. But if they're not going to hear it, or if they're going to fight us or throw explosives or try to, then we need a little bit of a heavier hand. And perhaps we've reached that spot, as America's reached that spot before, in 1960s, 1660s or 1860s rather, and so it happens. But I'd like to do it the easy way, but they might make us do it the hard way.
All right, our last question of the evening comes from this gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Keemer. I'm 17, and I wanted to know, as a young conservative, how can we grow up to be influential as you are, and to influence minds as you are, and to be big like Charlie and you, and have a great podcast to listen to every day?
Go on. Give him. Can we have the microphone back? Oh, that's a very, very kind question to ask. I used to say the key to making it in political media, the most important thing to do if you want to make it in political media, is be friends with Jeremy Boring, and Ben Shapiro and Caleb Robinson, and you know our pals who started the Daily Wire, which is good advice. But I would say if you want to have a political career in a public life and you want to, you know, affect the country for the better, then you're 17, you're so young, you're so precocious, you're obviously, you know, self-possessed. The best thing you can do right now is to read everything and to practice it. But for yourself. Do not, I repeat, do not try to get famous at 17. You will regret it. And I have friends who have done it around that age, and they do regret it, because you don't really know what you think. And so when you start out in politics, just like if you start out to be a stand-up comedian or a baseball player or something, what you're really doing is an impression of someone else. So you go out there and you're gonna, you know, if you want to be a comedian, you're gonna go do a Norm Macdonald routine. Or if you want to be a baseball player, you're gonna try to stand like Aaron Judge at 15 feet high. And if you want to be in politics, you're gonna do an impression of Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan or Ben Shapiro or Tucker Carlson or whatever, or Charlie Kirk probably, which is good. You know, it's good. You kind of work it out that way. But do that on your own time and read and figure out what you think. And I would say enter into public life when you have something to say and do that is not already being said and done by other people. And I suspect you can. But that's what makes it worthwhile, and that's what will make it about the country and not just about you. Because if it's about you, I don't think it'll really work. And two, it will get boring, even to you, it'll get boring. But if it's about something else, that will fascinate you, and that will impel you to dig further, and that really could contribute something to the country. And you're 17, so you got plenty of time to work on it. You're already pretty far down the line anyway. And you've already developed the excellent political skill to flatter the speaker that you're asking a question. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Knowles. And thank you all for being here tonight. Drive safe. God bless you.